So the wonderful thing about this project is I've made so many new friends and really lifetime friends. And I met Jeanie because she came to Andrew and Andrew's party here, which was probably 2 years ago. And she has made some extraordinary discoveries about the 14th Earl, which I'm going to let her explain to you herself. But Professor Jeanie Grant-Moore is Professor Emerita of English from the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh and recently retired from the English department at the University of San Diego. She received her undergraduate degree from UCLA, her master's degree from San Diego State University, and her doctorate from the University of California. She's taught a wide variety of classes at all institutions and led students on study tours to the UK, as well as other European countries, with Andrew, I believe, which I've done. In 2018, she received the Faculty Award for Outstanding Teaching at the University of San Diego. She gave a series of lectures at Oxford University with Professor Andrew Shaughnessy, with whom she had earlier co-created, co-taught, and co-administered semesters abroad at Cambridge University. She continues to guest lecture at San Diego University, as well as the University of California, San Diego. And I'm going to let her explain, and rather than do a spoiler alert, what you're about to hear about.
Right, thank you. Okay, I'm very happy to be here to talk to you about Earl of Derby and Charles Dickens, and I'll be referring to him as Stanley or Lord Stanley or Lord Derby as appropriate, I hope, according to the time period. But I thought I might say a word about James Fenimore Cooper, since Lady Derby mentioned it earlier, because the two of them also met. And there were some interesting things that came out of that, because they were traveling on their tour to North America, and they were traveling in upstate New York. And the Derby, the Stanley party, actually met up with James Cooper and the people he was traveling with, and they traveled together for a while. And Stanley was very interested because he had read a book already by James Fenimore Cooper. So as they traveled on, they came over the hill and they looked into this beautiful glade that was a valley. And Stanley said to Cooper, "That's the place for a romance." And Cooper took him to heart, and the result of that was The Last of the Mohicans. And that anecdote is verified by Cooper's daughter, so it wasn't something apocryphal that Stanley made up. But also, what was interesting about New York was that when they were settling various small cities in New York, there was a period of time where they were naming things after classical cities. And so this one committee picked Corinth. And no, we can't do that because that little settlement over there is going for Corinth. And they went through all the classical cities that they could think of. And one man in the committee said, he said, I have an idea. I just read this wonderful poem. It was written by someone at Oxford. It received the undergraduate award for the whole university, and it was called Syracuse, and it was written in Latin. It's beautiful. And they said, let's name it Syracuse. And the Syracuse poem that won that prize was written by Stanley. So that's an interesting kind of little American. There's Stanleys all over Canada, but Syracuse is there, and that's another one. So Dickens and Derby. So these two 19th century larger-than-life figures coming from very, very different backgrounds. One from the working class, the other from a noble family, obviously. They at first seem very unlikely to have had any connections at all. However, this happy accidental discovery I made in a discussion of Stanley's journal chronicling his trip to North America. And that led me to uncover some key ties, literary, political, philosophical, that connect what they are by any measure you can think of, two of the era's most eminent Victorians. Now, how well these two knew each other through the years is kind of a matter of conjecturing. What is not disputed well is that before Dickens became a personality, so let's see, what is not disputed is that before Dickens became a renowned author, and years before Stanley became prime minister, they met at really what was a crucial juncture of their lives in very different ways in their respective careers. And they took their measure of one another. I'd like to just tell you about that first meeting and in 1833, and then about some of their views of the political and the sort of philosophical views that they developed that sometimes were very, very different and sometimes very much the same. Dickens considered himself almost a radical liberal, and yet many of the times his views turn out to be much more conservative than those of Derby. Okay, so it was during a visit to Knowsley here, in a discussion, everybody was talking about this recently discovered journal and this trip to America, and I thought to myself, well, this sounds very much like the trip that Charles Dickens made to America later on, but I thought, is that really interesting that they did the same thing? Pretty much, Dickens' itinerary wasn't quite as long, nor was his trip. But then I learned the reasons for the trip, and you've heard these already, but I'm going to review it for you because it's kind of elemental to the whole story. So there were two reasons, really. One was political, because Stanley was already at that young age a member of Parliament, and he had dared to vote in a different way than his grandfather, the 12th Earl, and that really displeased him. And in addition, you'll remember, we heard the story, that he disapproved of the young man that Stanley intended to marry. And her family were staunch Tories, and of course, the Darbys had been traditionally Whigs all along. So Lord Derby instructed Stanley to go. Stanley called it his banishment, but he wanted him to forget this woman, never talk to her, never do anything. And I do think it is amusing that he did figure out a way to communicate, because he did write to her mother. So his intended, Emma Caroline Boodle Wilbraham, also communicated with his friends. And we are excited that those letters might be available. We've been looking all over for them without any luck so far. But he did feel he was banished, but he nonetheless decided to use this travel time for good purpose. He wanted to go to Canada, of course, but he also wanted to see what was going on in this newborn United States of America that was not really very old, to just observe the building of a new society in the newborn country, the United States. And so after 8 or 9 months traveling in the US and Canada, he did receive word that his grandfather had relented, and just very abruptly, he left, as Andrew said earlier, without even notifying his traveling companions. Just got on the first boat he could, sailed back to England, and married her in 1 month, 1 month later. And even the others were going to see Thomas Jefferson in his last year of life at Monticello, and he just, forget Jefferson, I'm going home, marry this woman. So this romantic story just was charming all of us, but what really struck me about it was that the circumstances sounded very familiar to me. It sounded very much like a story that Dickens had written, because when he returned from his own trip from America, he wrote a novel called Martin Chuzzlewit. And the circumstances of that eponymous character were very similar to this, to those of Stanley. And in Dickens' story, Martin's grandfather, like Lord Derby, was displeased with him. Martin had proposed to a young woman without his approval and went to the United States. And after extended travels in America, his grandfather relented, allowed him to marry the woman of his choice. So these parallels just really intrigued me, and I began to search for a possible connection between Stanley and Dickens. And I thought, they must have met. So I went online, and lo and behold, I find this blog. And this blog is written by James O'Keefe, who's sitting right there, right now, to whom I'm ever grateful, because he told this whole story in his blog about the meeting between Dickens and Stanley. So I want to just tell you just a minute about Stanley, what was going on with him. He back from his own trip in 1825, he's happily married, and he's resuming his duties in Parliament. And in February of 1833, as the Chief Secretary of Ireland, Stanley gave a 6-hour speech on what was known as the Irish Coercion Bill. And it was the custom for reporters in the gallery at that time to record the speech in shorthand and then transcribe it so that it could be published in the newspaper the next day. It's very interesting that actually, technically, it was still illegal to do this, but it was tolerated. It had not been, it was a felony centuries earlier. And it was never removed. It was still illegal, but then it was tolerated. And so they didn't have very comfortable accommodations up there. But anyway, what happened when the speech was very lengthy, and the 6 hours is pretty lengthy, they took turns. The reporters took turns, and they did a segment at a time, just taking turns. So when the next day, Stanley is reading this transcription of his speech, and he realizes that the very first part of it is perfect. The very last part of it is perfect. The middle parts are just not accurate whatsoever. So naturally, he wanted his speech to be perfect, and so he contacted the editor of the Mirror of Parliament and said he wanted the man to come over who had done this first part and the last part, because he wanted to re-deliver this speech. And so the man came in and into the house, and they were sort of surprised because he was very, very young. And they said, "You're really too young to have done this." He said, No, I did this. I did it. And so so that man was the 21-year-old, very youthful-looking Charles Dickens. So a contemporary of Dickens quotes him directly as he describes this meeting between Stanley and his father. And Dickens said that when he arrived, and this is quoting, "Both gentlemen were extremely courteous to me, but I noted their evident surprise at the appearance of so young a man. While we spoke together, I had taken a seat extended to me in the middle of the room. Mr. Stanley told me he wished to go over the whole speech and have it written out by me. He tried to induce me to sit at a desk, but at that time in the House of Commons, there was nothing but one's knees to write upon, and I had formed the habit of doing my work that way. Without further pause, he began and went rapidly on, hour after hour, to the end, often becoming very much excited and frequently bringing down his hand with great violence upon the desk. And Stanley was very pleased with the resulting transcription. And he returned that revised version to the newspaper, along with a note that was full of praise for Dickens, and wrote that to his employer, prophesying a bright future for this young man. So this meeting between the two men came at a time in their lives that was significant, although for very different reasons. Stanley was actually solidifying his reputation as a key political figure in Parliament, having already served as Under Secretary of the Colonies and now as the Chief Secretary of Ireland. He had introduced, and I know this is repetitive, but I think that it's important to understand what he had already accomplished, because he had introduced or advocated several very important bills: the Catholic Emancipation Bill of 1829, First Reform Bill of 1832, and the National Education Act in Ireland that Andrew explained earlier about having non-denominational schools, where I think, having seen in Canada how the idea of these children, getting that idea at that point, if they could just meet as children, that perhaps they could have a more amicable relationship. He was just poised to propose the abolition of slavery, and that came about a month later after this speech. Now, Dickens, 13 years younger, would not yet have any idea that just 3 years further on, he would be a rising star in the literary world. But what was very significant about him right at this time was that as a young reporter, he's looking down from this gallery on a group of people, members of social classes that he would never, ever would have been exposed to earlier on. And he was privy to what was the absolutely important issue of the era, the conflicting views, the arguments, the analyses. And that was really an eye-opening practical education for him that augmented this self-education he'd been undergoing at the British Library himself every day since he was the age of 18, to make up for the very poor amount of schooling that he had had as a child. So during these early years of their acquaintance, Dickens was positively disposed toward Stanley, and he actually refers to him by name in his first book, Sketches by Boz, that was published 3 years after that in 1836. And despite being classified as a novel, he actually uses some real names in the book, it's really an authentic fictional book that it's really scenes of London society. So in one of the pieces, a parliamentary sketch, an unnamed elderly man, a member of Parliament, is talking to another elderly man, and they're lamenting with this old-timers and that the House of Commons is just not running the way it used to. Not in the good old days. All these old guys are gone, they've died, they've passed away. It's just not working well at all. So only disdain for these younger men coming in. And this particular older man says that Macaulay is a regular imposter, he says. But he allows that Lord Stanley may do something one of these days, but he's too young. So Stanley would have recognized that private joke between him as he was perceived by his father and being considered too young. So he's teasing him a little bit. And he knew that he would read this because he sent him a copy of it, signed, hot off the press, that included a letter asking in rather obsequious terms pardoned for being so presumptuous as to send Stanley his novel. But in the letter, he calls himself an enthusiastic, though humble, admirer of Stanley. Now, for some reason, this admiration turns a bit sour at some point with the passage of years. And Dickens' growing fame emboldened him to refer to Stanley, not always in a positive way, through satirical allusions publicly, but then in private letters, sometimes harsh and critical, for political reasons that are difficult sometimes to understand. And one of those satirical comments appears in Martin Chuzzlewit, and I'd like to return to that right now. So, the most compelling connection is the one I've already mentioned. Stanley and the main character in the novel, involving their grandfathers and their disapproval of their grandson's chosen brides. We've seen this picture before over here with Emma Caroline, Lady Stanley, later Countess of Derby. And that's after they're married with their first son. And of course, this is the 12th Earl who has expressed his disapproval originally. And then we have the grandfather in Martin Chuzzlewit, old Martin Chuzzlewit. Whoops, went too fast, sorry. It's always amused me that this old grandfather looks a lot like this man, especially in caricature that you see of the 12th Earl. But this illustration from the book he doesn't look anything like him. And here we go. But this is also a picture of Mary, who is Martin's intended. Also, although, it must be said that Dickens' own travel in America provide most of the events and plots, side plots of Martin Chuzzlewit. But there are some details that don't apply to him. So for instance, when Dickens arrived in America, he sailed into Boston. But the real Stanley and the fictional Martin both arrived in New York City. And you just wonder why. Nancy Aycock Metz also notices something very strange about the novel and the particular time frame, because there were certain markers of time that were sort of peculiar, because earlier the modes of transportation, things like the cost of postage, fashions, political events, and the changes in economy locate the first part of that novel in the years just before 1830. And then when Martin reaches America, Metz sees the shift in time to around 1840 and suggests that creates a picture of just time moving forward from the old world to the new world. But it is a kind of an interesting coincidence, perhaps, that it also places the beginning of that novel in the time of Stanley's trip, and the later part of the English part in terms of Stanley's trip, and then the later part of the novel is during the time of Dickens' own trip. Okay, another allusion to Stanley. Again, I credit this. James should stand up and take a bow or something, but it comes near the end of the novel. When Martin has returned to England from America, and he arrives in a city that has all the landmarks of Liverpool, and he happens upon the laying of a foundation stone for New School, which he had actually designed himself as a young architect. And he has to stand by and watch his former architectural teacher take the credit for his own design that Martin has done. And there's a big hoopla and celebration. You can see the picture in there of Martin That's from Martin Chuzzlewit. So similar circumstances surrounded this young architect who had designed the collegiate school, the real collegiate school in Liverpool. He had, his name was Harvey Lonsdale Elms, and he had designed this massive St. George's Hall, which you all should see in Liverpool if you've never seen it. And that was being constructed at the time. And he had also drawn up plans for this collegiate school. And the terms that gave him no control over the construction of the school were not acceptable to him. And because of that, the plans were actually kind of, the convoluted set of circumstances were taken away from him. So he did the same thing in standing by. Now this caused a big scandal. It would have been known in London. It would have been known by everyone. But the two of them are doing essentially the same thing and just standing by and watching other people get credit for that work. And in the real circumstances, Lord Derby laid the foundation stone for that school. And so that was the ceremony that was being reflected in Martin Chuzzlewit. Now, the interesting thing is that he laid the cornerstone in the fictional novel, and there is a kind of satirical picture of him as being a bit supercilious, but more than that, satirizing the way that people are responding to him, that they're ultra just kowtowing to him. And but it isn't entirely positive. But one reason it isn't positive is that he refers to him as the gentleman, the member for gentlemanly interest. And he's a bit supercilious, as I said before, but that is the main kind of satire for him. And that, of course, insinuates his self-interest as an aristocratic land-owning member of Parliament. And this is actually a bit unfair, since more than once Stanley actually voted against his own advantage. And one of those times was when involved the redistribution of a franchise of East Redford, and a vote for it to be distributed to Manchester would have really benefited Stanley. But he actually voted for it to go to Birmingham, saying that he believed that would be better for the country as a whole, and that is in the Hawkins biography. So from Dickens' point of view, something is changing in the way that they've moved from kind of amicably relating to one another to something a little less positive. Now, privately, Dickens was much more direct in his criticism, as in an 1852 letter, which describes Lord Derby's outgoing government as evasive, shifting, and juggling, and one which has material damaged the character and honor of public men in England. So he's not mincing words there. It is in a private letter, which wouldn't have been known publicly, but you can see that his feelings certainly have undergone a change. Now, no additional verified face-to-face meetings between these two have been recorded, but their social worlds did overlap at times. Stanley's father was a member of the Athenaeum Club, and as was Dickens. Possibly conversations occurred there, maybe amicable ones, maybe especially earlier on. They did have friends in common. For instance, Walter Savage Landor, the writer and poet, was a very good friend of Dickens, and he was an acquaintance of Stanley's that he knew quite well. Now, Dickens had a lot of friends in Parliament that knew Stanley, but they were most of them his political adversaries. And it may have been that their opinions colored Dickens' feelings about Derby, as did maybe Stanley's shift in political parties. So, as we've heard, Stanley moved from being a moderately liberal Whig to form a new conservative party, one that was based on old Whig philosophy and carefully separating himself from Robert Peel and their Tory party. And he wanted to navigate a middle ground that would retain some of the old Whig values. Eventually he did ally himself with Peel. And Dickens really didn't like Peel. He said, "I am no Peelite." Let's see, where is this quote? Calling Peel and his Tory supporters people politically whom I despise and abhor. So he was even less mincing in words, you might say, than he was about Derby's policies. But even so, Dickens' politics were not what you might consider liberal. His shifting views are really hard to follow at times. And they were sometimes similar to Stanley's, sometimes much more conservative, especially regarding religious concerns, especially those involving Ireland, slavery and abolition, and reform. Okay, so first, religious issues in Ireland. Before Stanley began his trip to America, his mentor, the third Marquess of Lansdowne, had recommended the reading list that you told about earlier. And one of the books on there was actually a novel, and it was a novel by one of Lansdowne's friends, Maria Edgeworth, and it was called The Absentee. And it told the story of an aristocrat who neglected his Irish estates. And it also told the story of his son's determination to improve the conditions of the impoverished tenants. That really touched Stanley very deeply. And he worried that the Derby estates in Ireland might be committing those same injustices. And he was convinced that one of the major problems there was the absentee landlord. So actually Stanley's firsthand look at some of the conditions for the Irish in the United States, in Canada, and in the United States, reinforced this desire to take some action when he came home. And in a letter to Emma's mother, he said, quote, "Poor Ireland, it is very near my heart, and I do entertain a confident hope that I may be able to do some good there." And he was in earnest, and when this young couple moved back after they were married, they went almost immediately to Ireland to stay at the Derby property for some time. And he began formulating some plans to ease conditions that he found there. I was going to tell you about the National Plan for Education, but since Andrew has covered that thoroughly, it just the integrating the children of different religious beliefs where they could receive their religious education separately, but learn to grow up together. And national schools would be open to all children. He also enacted some changes that made financial support of Catholic churches in Ireland more equitable. Now, back in Parliament, after serving as the Undersecretary for the Colonies, he assumed this challenging office of Chief Secretary for Ireland in 1830. He did effect some changes that would improve the Irish and the Catholics in Ireland and in England, and he was a very strong supporter of the Act for Catholic Emancipation, which was sometimes called the Catholic Relief Act. And that allowed the Irish to be members of Parliament and have representation there. So Catholic emancipation created massive protests among numbers of outraged English Anglicans. And you can see in this caricature of it, it was quite violent, but an unusual demonstration of hostility was devised by the Dowager Duchess of Richmond. And she had stuffed rats placed on the walls of her drawing room and named them after, each of the rats, after any supporter of the Catholic Relief Act. So you can bet one of them up there, at least one of them was named Derby. So now, no matter what beneficial changes that Stanley effected for Ireland, his nemesis in Parliament, the fiery Irish Daniel O'Connell, rarely approved of any of his actions. O'Connell was just fundamentally opposed to him because he didn't like the 1800 Act of Union, and Derby, of course, wanted the two countries to be together. So that 1833 speech, let's go back to that for a minute, that by Stanley, that Dickens recorded, was the Irish Coercion Act, and that would legitimate more government control in the face of the vicious kinds of disputes settled unfairly in courts if there were religious prejudice against any of the defendants, but also just more commonly by mobs and most frequently by murder. So O'Connell really vigorously opposed this bill. Stanley supported it, but he did have strong limits to avoid a police state. And Dickens' ambivalent opinions on the Irish issue and Catholicism make it a bit difficult to imagine what he might have thought. Dickens was moved by one of O'Connell's speeches and very emotional addresses to the Commons, but he also described his rhetoric as frothy and insubstantial. Now, like Stanley, Dickens did have some sympathy he exhibited for Catholics. So, for example, his historical novel, Barnaby Rudge, published in 1841, recounts the events of the 1780 Gordon riots, which had been fueled by rampant anti-Catholicism. An earlier, more limited Catholic Relief Act passed in 1778 had permitted Roman Catholics to own land and to join the army. And this conveniently came at a time where they needed more soldiers because the American Revolution was going on. The 1778 Act had elicited even stronger resistance than what occurred after the Catholic Relief Act in Stanley's time. But in 1780, challenging that first Catholic Relief Act, Lord George Gordon, who was a member of Parliament and leader of the Protestant organization, organized a huge anti-Catholic protest. And on the day that there was a vote on Gordon's petition to repeal the act, there were 50,000 people standing outside the Houses of Parliament. And when the anti-Catholic crowd heard that the petition had been denied, the outrage just erupted into violence, and they broke into the prisons. The prisons were opened. They started just by burning any Catholic homes, any places of worship at all that existed at the time, burning those. But then just wild riots all the way through London. And King George declared martial law. activated troops to quell violence, and 25 people were hanged, 400 people were arrested, approximately 300 people were shot and killed. And the novel really supports the Catholic Relief Bill, as well as the action of the government in repressing that violence. And that stance could be read as a positive attitude on the part of Dickens towards Stanley's 1833 speech, advocating that response to violence, albeit with strong restrictions designed to avoid the extreme measures that were taken by the government in the Gordon, as a result of the Gordon riots. And oftentimes Dickens expressed one of his issues with the Chartist movement, which was who advocated for universal franchise. He actually disapproved of them, and especially because of their violence. He liked no violence whatsoever. So my guess is that he would have approved at that. But certainly his fictional but accurate description of the events clearly supports the persecuted Catholics. But the reader of Barnaby Rudge should not be misled, because Dickens undercuts this apparent sympathy for Catholics in his preface to the novel when he makes this disclaimer. Although he characterizes the novel as a plea for tolerance and decries this intolerance behind the shameful tumults that were depicted in the novel and in reality, and although he claims he has many Catholic friends, he says that his description of the event has been impartially painted by one who has no sympathy with the Roman Church. I am no papist, he says. Now, despite their understanding of Catholics as a persecuted group, both Stanley and Dickens mistrusted the power of the Catholic Church as an institution. While Dickens wasn't any great supporter of the Anglican Church either, he described himself often as a Unitarian, especially at one point in his life. But Derby was a stanch Anglican. He was not supportive of any reform measures in Ireland that would have negatively affected the Anglican Church there. But he certainly was in support of measures that would benefit the Catholic Church there. His concern for the Irish, his commitment to equitable treatment of Catholics and the Catholic Church did not diminish over time. Now, Dickens, on the other hand, had become vehemently anti-Irish, anti-Catholic by 1851, making slurs about the Irish, referring them to ruffians and other derogatory names, even while enjoying a very positive reception in Ireland when he was on his speaking tours there. So the two men's opinions sometimes diverged on the contentious issue of slavery and abolition, and both Dickens and Stanley had been appalled by their firsthand views of slavery in America. And of course, when Stanley returned, he passed this abolition bill that we've heard about. And Dickens spoke out passionately about slavery himself in his own periodical Household Words, and in the non-fictional account of his 1842 trip to America, which was called American Notes, that he published right before Martin Chuzzlewit. But Martin Chuzzlewit contains some equally heated passages against slavery, condemning it. But curiously, in the same book, Dickens also mocks the abolitionists, as he will do later on in his novel Bleak House as well. And he thinks the abolitionists were very hypocritical. And you have to think about the fact that he's writing 10 years after the abolition of slavery in Britain, but he's still focused mostly on the cruelty of slavery rather than abolition itself. And he actually credits American slaveholders for being more humane than the Spaniards. So he advocated for more of a piecemeal solution to the problem of slavery, thinking that if they just went on, that it would become apparent at some point that it would be just as efficient financially to not have slaves, and it would just die away by itself. And during the Civil War, Dickens supported the South unequivocally. As time went on, his comments became increasingly racist, calling black African savages and worse things, and judges them as being incapable of ever being civilized. So the final issue, the issue of reform, might have been a catalyst in Dickens' increasing hostility. But again, it's complicated. But he just always felt the government was not doing enough for anything. That earlier reform bill increased the percentage of male voters from 13 to 18%. But that was just such a minimally expanded franchise. That would not have enabled members of Dickens' own family to vote at that period of time, since none of them owned land at that point, which was a requirement. And in the years following, Stanley did resist further reform, as he was fearful himself about the encroachment of democracy, believing that power should remain with the aristocracy, who in turn had a duty to use that power for good for the country. And of course, later, and we've talked already about the 1867 reform bill that expanded the franchise. And Dickens seemed to not make so many public allusions to Stanley, satirically, that could have been taken for someone else, maybe. And in his letters, it seems that he didn't seem to have so much problem with Stanley after that. He himself, as I just said, he did not approve of the Chartist movement that wanted full expansion of the suffrage for everyone. So he just doesn't seem that far from Stanley. But actually, in a different aspect of reform, social and institutional reform, Dickens believed that the governing body of Parliament did really little to nothing. And when Dickens went to the United States in 1842, despite having read some negative accounts beforehand by other travel writers, he still expected to see something that could be a model for Britain. And his disillusionment with American society and government was really profound. He said, "This is not the republic that I came to see. It's not the republic of my imagination." And he had these radical and rather naive ideas before he left, that just sweep away all British institutions, just start over with a new political ideology. And those were really swept away with the disenchantment with America. And at the same time as much faith in institutions in Britain, he was really left without much of a philosophy, except just to think that if everyone could just be a better person, then we would have a better world. But of course, that moral reform, he said, must precede social reform. And a Christmas Carol would illustrate that philosophy. So anyway, his mood and his work became much darker and pessimistic after his return from America. And he was active in trying to effect changes himself where he could, through helping countless individuals, establishing charities, a home for women who had fallen into prostitution, which was actually had some very successful results. He had no faith in Parliament to address the plight of the needy. He characterized it as a circus and a bear garden, and its members as dustmen amidst rubbish. So I think actually that his disgust for Parliament, more than anything, might have been the basis of any kind of feeling toward negative feelings toward Derby. So there you have these two men at the end of their lives. If they had maintained a personal relationship throughout the years, Dickens would have realized that Derby actually did a lot for the poor. And he did provide help to the needy, especially for those in Lancashire. For example, people who were destitute during that cotton famine in the early 1860s benefited from a central relief fund for Lancashire, which Derby pushed for and headed himself. And by 1863, almost 500,000 people had benefited by receiving ongoing relief. And his own personal donation was the largest ever given in England to a dedicated fund. And his concern for public welfare was also reflected through his service of a chairman of a parliamentary committee, which led to an 1863 act regulating industrial pollution, which had been very bad, especially in Lancaster, where the alkali works had seeped hydrochloric acid into the soil and poisoned the drinking water, and also created toxic emissions. So, considering his antipathy to Parliament, it's not surprising that Dickens refused more than one offer to stand for Parliament himself. He felt that he had a lot more power through his writing of literature, and this is no doubt the case. As Dickens' works were read by all classes of society, from the poorest people who sometimes in groups would get together a shilling to read the next installment of a novel, and then those who could read to the others, and then all the way up through the ranks of the social order, all the way to Queen Victoria, who was a big fan of Dickens. And no doubt, those books like Oliver Twist created empathy, although it's kind of a funny aside that Lord Macaulay said, I don't want to read about that stuff, I want to hear about it, I don't want to deal with it. So it's kind of a funny reaction. But most people seem to respond in a different way. And I think that the empathy that created was really a social consciousness that was created that really was an impetus for some changes. It's interesting that there is a full volume of Dickens' work here at Knowsley that was published 2 years before Lord Derby's death, the 14th Earl's death. And Derby is said to have relaxed at times by translating Latin verse, but even more often, apparently, his daughter tells us in her memoir, by reading a novel. And it's certainly pleasant, not implausible at all, to imagine that some of those were written by Charles Dickens. And Dickens later in life wrote respectfully, if not entirely uncritically, about Derby at his death in 1869. In a private letter, he commented, "The news of Lord Derby's death will reach you, I suppose, at about the same time as this letter. A rash, impetuous, passionate man, but a great loss for his party as a man of mind and mark." And that rash, impetuous, passionate, those adjectives might also apply equally to Dickens himself. That's all I have. Thank you.